My name is Caitlin McConnell, and I'm here today with Larry Sifford, an expert in woodworking who builds wooden caskets and restores canoes. The date is February 27th, 2024, and we are in Larry's home in Stone County, Missouri. This oral history is part of a collaboration between Ozarks Alive and Missouri State University Libraries. Thank you so much for letting me come visit with you today.
Welcome, and I'm glad to talk to you. I enjoy your writing and your programs all the time, so I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. Well, kind of first off, I know we're going to talk about a couple of different things, but could you just share a little bit about your background and how you got into woodworking in the first place?
Well, actually, my background, I was raised as a young boy in the Ozarks here over on Bull Shoals Lake in Ozark County. And I was born at West Plains, Missouri, and my grandfather was a fishing guide on North Fork Lake.
Really?
And he built his own boats. So as a young boy, I watched him build several boats during those years. He would bring them in after a while. Of course, wood, as you know, if it's not treated properly, if it's left sitting out, has a tendency to rot. And so what would happen is he would fish and he would pull his boat up on the shore, tie it up, and then after several years, it would be replacing or whatever, or he'd like to try maybe a newer design after having a boat for a certain length of time. Boy, it would be nice to have this or that or this thing. So that's where I kind of got my love and my interest in boat building or boat canoes. Now, the reason I got into it was late in life, because after we played in a band for years, a bluegrass group, we then retired that band, and I was left with some time on my hands. And I thought to myself, what would I like to do that would have some lasting benefit and enjoyment for me, just seeing it restored back to life, but also could bring joy and interest to someone else if they enjoyed it or would like something like that hanging in their home or their business. So I went and purchased, I think I started with one canoe and brought it home. And then the next thing I know, somebody saw it and said, "Oh, I'd love to have that. What would you charge me for it?" And there's not a lot of money to be made in it. It's not like something you do because it takes too long of a process sometimes. And so it's just a hobby. It's kind of turned into a small business for me, but I just love to take my time on them and think about maybe who paddled them up a stream, or how many fish were ever caught in one of them, or stuff of that nature.
Do you have an estimate of how many you've done so far?
I would say probably year to date, maybe 35, 40 I have done. Now you got to understand, some of them take months to restore, and some take weeks. And even some you can get by with maybe a few days. It's just according to how bad they are. And after a while, I'll take you for a little tour and I'll show you some of the ones that are that you could turn and do within a week or two. Then I'll show you some that's going to take maybe like a month or two.
Where do you find them? Is it just kind of all over?
That is a good question. That's a question everybody asks me. Where do you find these things? And honestly, they're like anything of the past. They don't make them anymore. At least the manufacturers don't make them anymore. Now, there's a few independent canoe builders, wood canoe builders, still in operation in the northeast and northwest portions of our country, and on this continent, I should say. Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, upstate New York, Michigan, Wisconsin. Just recently, I purchased a collection of old canoes, some that were built by the man that his estate is being dissipated by his wife. And that is in British Columbia, in Canada. And so Judy and I, my wife, we will be leaving this year in May, and with our trailer, and we'll take our time and go on up through uh, Montana, Idaho, and on up to Washington State, crossed over into the Canadian province of British Columbia, and then we're going to an island by the name of Pender Island, where this man and his wife lived. And he built some canoes himself, and then he also was kind of like me, loved old canoes, so he would pick some up and try to restore them. Well, when he passed away, he had these canoes left, and so I saw this ad that had them advertised. So I called and began to research them, had them send me pictures and photographs of what they were and how much they wanted for the collection. And then we arrived at a purchase price, and I sent a deposit. So now they're waiting for me to go pick up, and bring back to the Ozarks.
Wow. Well, you mentioned your grandfather's influence in the beginning, but when you got into this as an adult, were you largely self-taught, or did you kind of have to work with other people to learn the skill?
It honestly is a self-taught to a degree, because there's nobody around here that builds them or really has built wooden canoes. So a lot of it I get off of possible online direction. Remembering how my grandfather, because even on boats, fishing boats, which my grandfather used, they weren't canoes, you still have the gunnels on the upper edge of the boat that still are shaped into V's. The only difference is with a canoe, you not only have your V in, but you also have then the raised nose. So the wood that you bring around the sides of the gunnels and then bring up to the bow have not only got a bow this way, but they got a bow this way. And the idea behind it is to keep that one piece of wood flowing in that way rather than having a lot of splices. You see what I'm saying? So it takes steaming or wetting and shaping and clamping, and then allowing the wood to conform to the shape of the existing canoe. And you do that just a very slow process, because if you try to force it too quick, it'll pop, snap, and then you just say, okay, I'll start over.
So during the restoration process, it's a lot like building one originally, in a way.
It is, and there's different parts. It's just not only the gunnels, but the ribs in the floor that support. And most people don't realize this, because they just see a red canoe or a green canoe. But on the wooden ones, they not only had their, what you would call the center keel that ran down the middle, and then you had your ribs that would come up to the sides, and then your top gunnels would go and hold the ribs in place all the way around as it formed. So sometimes I end up and have to replace ribs, or I have to replace portions of the keel. And so it's honestly, it's a lot harder to restore than it is to build new. Because what I try to do is I try to leave as much of the original as I can. So what I will do is, if I'm going to replace a portion within the canoe, I cut back till I find good solid wood. And then from there on, or from there back, I put a piece in and refinish it, and then I have to start to stain it, and not only stain it to match, but age it to last as well. Because you don't want a piece of real fine straight edge wood running along a piece of worn wood. Now, I sell to all different sorts of people today. I've got a lot of customers, like people, if you're watching here in the Missouri, I'm sure you're familiar with the restaurants called Flat Creek, Billy Gale's, and all of those two restaurants alone have many of my canoes and boats in them when they decorate the restaurants. But also, probably one of my largest clients and best clients is Bass Pro. And I sell to Bass Pro to decorate their new stores with.
Wow.
And so they like a worn look. They don't want them looking brand new showroom. Like, now some people do. Some people want them in their homes to really pop, you know. But Bass Pro tends to want to show the aged look and the history and the memories of it. To even the extent of maybe even leaving some of the canvas loose so you see the ribs in the side.
Ah.
And, you know, to me as a restorer, I'm sitting back going, well, you know, but that's their taste. That's what they want. So I have to try to find and leave it and take it back to the way that they want it, and then leave it sit there. It's kind of like, to me, it's kind of like an unfinished painting.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. but yet, if that's, you know, your customer is basically the person that decides what they want. So I try to please them. But restoring, again, is a lot more difficult than starting with a new piece of wood and going, because you're dealing with something that's 100 years old or 90 years old. Or my oldest canoe that I've had in age to restore was a 1908 B.N. Morris. So that canoe was 116 years old. And so when you start dealing with 116-year-old wood, screws, and brass was the big thing back then for screws. So I have to replace with brass screws, brass nails, or whatever I'm using at the time.
Is it hard to source those sorts of things, or are they still readily available?
There a lot of the things that you need are still produced, kind of like for antique cars. There are, out in the Northwest, there are still some companies that will manufacture brass keel runs, brass screws, brass. They're expensive. They're, you know, anything like that is very expensive, but it is available to a degree. Now, sometimes I've run into some things that I couldn't find, you know, like on Old Town canoes. Old Town canoes were recognized by a star, kind of well, they call it a star, but it's a triangle on both ends screw that would go down from the top of the gunnels and then have nuts on the bottom of them. Nobody makes those anymore. So you have to use something that kind of matches, that looks the part. But you can see, and I try to find as much, if I can salvage some off of something else, I'll do that.
I assume most of your customers, this is for decoration and things like that, but do you have any customers that actually use these in the river as well?
Yes, there are some that are functional. And in fact, I just put one over on the lake on Table Rock here at a home and hung it. My grandson, Hunter Sifford, is my assistant when it comes to hanging boats and canoes, because it takes two people to usually do it. You've got to get ladders in place. And so we hung this one on the back deck of a man's home, but it is fully canvassed and it is fully functional. So I told him, I said, you know, if you want to take that thing down and put it in the lake, you can. He said, you know what? We're going to do that.
Wow.
Functional canoes are ones that naturally would be, I guess you could say, floatable, but you also have to be sure that they got the right type of canvas on them. Most people don't understand that they think when they see the colors, they go, oh, it's a metal canoe, or that's a plastic. It's not. On wood canoes, they use canvas. And they would they build the framework, and they put the ribs and the keel in, and then they'd go over the sides with real thin little planks of white cedar. And that white cedar conforms, and it conforms to the shape of the canoe. And so what happens is then they take and put the canvas over it and bring it up and then tie it in on the gunnels and tie it in on the keels. And they can last for years.
Wow.
I've got some 1930s and 1940 canoes in my shop right now that you'll see today that are very still functional.
Wow.
Very functional.
In all the work that you do, is it solely on canoes, or do you do anything with John boats as well?
I have worked a little bit on some other boats, and I actually do still have V boats. In fact, I've got a 1940s Thompson V bottom boat that's it's in storage right now, and it's a 12-foot long little fishing boat with oars. And I do restore some of those because there's a lot of people that do like, but I don't like to get into too big a boats because it's just too much for me to lift by myself and to have my wife try to get out and help me lift them. So most of the things that I tackle are something that usually one man can move around by himself, although I do have some tools, some little trailer things, dollies to help me move the boats around. But I do V-bottoms, fishing boats. Um, they're not as popular as canoes are, at least right at the moment. They kind of run in spurts like anything else. Some people like to sit them on their stern, the V-bottoms, you know, where they got that in the square stern. They'll sit them in the corner and they'll put shelves and things on them. But I love and I tend to see them more hung on, you know, walls or on ceilings and different things. With some people are putting the old Edison bulbs in them to reflect off of the beautiful wood that's on the inside of them. And so I kind of leave it up to the customer to tell me what they want, if they want a boat or if they want a canoe. But I've sold both, and I've worked on both. But I really prefer canoes.
Well, so all that said, let's segue just a little bit over to the caskets, if that's okay.
Yep.
And then at the end, we can circle back, and if there's anything else we want to talk about, we can do that too. So how did that begin? How did you start making caskets?
Okay, actually, we call them coffins.
Okay.
Because the wooden boxes of years ago were referred to more as coffins. And then the metal ones that came about in the later years have been known and kind of labeled as caskets. Coffins were traditional. They were part of the American scene from the East Coast to the West Coast to the Midwest through the Ozarks. And they're affordable. And so what happened was through our little church that I belonged to, the Sycamore Log Church. We at times begin a program, not at times, we do begin and have a program where we are willing to help people out during times of need, especially families that are maybe not capable of paying the type of money needed for a modern day casket, which can cost from $2,000 to $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, $10,000. And so we decided that what we would do is we would keep in store and in stock, would build a couple of them and keep them available for people that maybe could not afford and help them out through that as a gift to them during this time of sadness and grief for families. So that's kind of what inspired it, was the fact that there was a need. It was a financial need, and also a need to find a place that would still be something that a family wouldn't worry about putting their loved one in, but still feel like that it was beautiful. A lot of people, you can't beat the beauty of wood. In fact, the most expensive modern caskets are wood, and then wrapped in different types of metal. But we use cedar. Cedar is as fact, we all know here local, we use local cedar, what's called the juniper type cedar. And not only does it have a great aroma, but it's also a good wood that preserves much longer than pine. It's tight, it doesn't shrink like pine does and leave cracks after it dries out. And so it's a good wood to use for this type of application. And when you take it, you sand it, you finish it, it also has a beautiful finish on it. And the different colors that are in the junipers are, the light blonde color to the deep reds and the dark. And so they can be made to be very beautiful. So we try to keep two, but my wife and I, we've actually chosen that's going to be our decision to be buried in those types of traditional caskets or coffins. And we just, we know they're not for everyone, but, and today, naturally, there's a lot of people going to cremation. And I understand why. I have several friends that were morticians, and the cost of a funeral compared to the cost of cremation is a whole lot different. So we even actually build a little box that can be used for cremation remains as well, which looks like just a miniature coffin. And just whatever the families need. Actually, there is a young man that is a good friend of mine. His name is John Meyer.
Mm.
John Meyer is a tremendous musician, is well known in the bluegrass circles of Missouri and also Nashville.
Mm.
He's performed with many great people. Jimmy Fortune of the Statler Brothers fame. John's traveled with him and entertained as one of his sidemen.
Mm.
John has moved back now over to Seymour, Missouri, and has a young family, 2 children and one on the way. And he is starting up a wood shop. And he's a good craftsman, and has got the talent to learn and wants to learn. So I've kind of taken him under my wing and going to teach him the coffin, how to build, how to instruct with screws, make sure they're tight and good. But then I'm also introducing some of the canoe restoration ideas and things to him too, because there's coming a day, and there already is almost that day, that I'm getting to an age where I'm not going to be able to do it anymore. And so I'd like to hand these traditions down to another generation. And so the coffins, I always tease people. I said, you can also, if you're not going to use it, you can use it for a coffee table.
That's right.
Or you can put a trolling motor on the back of it. And so, it's kind of one of those things where you have to be a little bit humorous about coffins. That people, when you look at these things, automatically, it's kind of gruesome, But honestly, for those of us who are, I guess for lack of choice of words, a better choice of words, that are believers in an afterlife, then that box is just a temporary location for the old portion of us. And so I don't think there's a lot of need to expend a ton of money on what you're going to be in, at least from my perspective. And these are much cheaper, much cheaper. If you want me to, I can tell you the price. Would you like to know what they cost today?
Yes.
They run about $800. That's material and labor, ready to go, finished. And so that's substantially cheaper than a casket that you have to buy. And some of the cheaper caskets are made out of particle wood, particle board, and it's covered with a kind of a velvet. They're not near the quality that these are, and the solid, built. Now, some people have asked me about this. What about liners inside? What do you line it with? And honestly, most people that would buy a wood box coffin, I always share with them that their loved one, or they probably had a favorite blanket or an old family quilt. And so you can lay the quilt down inside of the coffin and lay the sides out. And maybe they had their favorite pillow. Who knows? And you could lay that in there with it. And then once that the viewing is over, you can fold the quilt over the top, put the lid on. And our coffins come with basically 2 lids, one for the lower part of the body and one for the upper part of the body, in case they do want to have a public viewing.
Wow. Well, so how long have you been making them approximately now?
Oh, probably now, I want to venture to say maybe about 5 years.
Okay.
I haven't been doing it a long time. Just when we got involved with the Little Sycamore Log Church and started helping people, and the word got out around the Stone County area that Sycamore Log Church was a church to go to for help if they needed help on certain things. When that word got out is when we began getting contacted about helping with this or helping with that. And so that's when we started it, just probably the last 4 to 5 years.
That's really amazing. I've not heard of a church doing something like that, and I love that. That's very touching. So,
well, Caitlin, it's too many times in today's world. Of course, when you get to be my age, if you haven't got enough to live on by now, you're in trouble. Okay. And so I just like to supplement my income a little bit with certain things, but helping people with something that's affordable and helping them to beautify their homes with a
Mm-hmm.
beautiful canoe that's something that they can't just find anywhere,
Mm-hmm.
you know, gives me great joy. It does, and my wife too. My wife helps me out a lot. In fact, actually, my wife has helped me line a canoe for some people
Mm-hmm.
before. She wasn't particularly real enthused at first about it, but you know, she gets. It's like anyone. You get used to seeing these, and
Mm-hmm.
you get used to it being around and recognize what it's for,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't. You get accustomed to
Mm-hmm.
it. You get accustomed to it.
How did you learn how to build them? Did you to teach yourself, or were there instructions you found, or?
Actually, like anything else in today's world, you get ready to build a house, you start looking at plans.
Mm-hmm.
And there are numerous plans. The Amish are
Mm.
actually a great resource for primitive type furniture,
Mm-hmm.
needs, whatever. And so there are plans online
Mm.
for people who could go, and if they wanted to build their own, they could.
Mm.
They just have to be able to have access to the lumber.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I actually use a sawmill
Mm-hmm.
that's in Christian County
Mm-hmm.
that cuts my lumber for me for the caskets or
Mm.
the coffins.
Mm-hmm.
And I go and pick it up, and it's usually dried quite well by the time I get it. And it's a true 1 inch thick cedar,
Mm-hmm.
not 3/4 of an inch. The difference between sawmill lumber and lumber that you buy at Meeks Lumber Company or
Mm-hmm.
any other lumber companies, or Herman Lumber or whomever it may be, when you ask for a piece of 1 inch lumber at the lumber companies, it's actually only 3/4 of an inch thick.
Mm.
Whereas when I ask for 1 inch thick lumber at the sawmill,
Mm-hmm.
I get a true 1 inch
Mm.
thick. So these are quality, heavy built units with
Mm.
floors in them and everything that, you know, will stand the test of time.
Mm. I'm sure it's very intricate in terms of the actual steps in this, but can you kind of give an overview as to like what you get the lumber, what happens next when you're
Well,
building?
basically, you have to start somewhere. So you start with a floor.
Uh-huh.
That's kind of the way we normally do it. Start with a floor.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a dimension that's already established,
Mm.
and we cut each board to place. Then we just put it together like a puzzle,
Mm.
and then we actually use screws and dowel rods
Mm.
drilled to keep the floors and things. A dowel rod, naturally, to those who might not know what it is basically you drill a hole and then you run a wooden peg into that hole,
Mm.
and then you have a hole on the other side that you run that wooden peg into,
Mm.
and then you glue and hold and clamp.
Mm.
Get the floor established, then you start up the sides,
Mm-hmm.
and you have your different angles that you cut. I'll show you after a while. I've got one opened up upstairs in the shop for you to look at, so you can actually see and take pictures
Thank
if you
you.
like, you know. But yeah, it's just like putting a little puzzle together. Then you go to the top,
Mm.
and you make the top in one piece
Mm.
initially. Then you cut it
Mm.
where the top viewing portion
Mm-hmm.
is butts perfectly up against the next piece,
Mm-hmm.
and you allow for that saw blade width on your length,
Mm.
so that when you push it back, it's tight.
Mm.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned, the ones that you have originally made for the church in case they're needed. Do you keep any others on hand, or is it kind of those two, and then if you need another one, you'll build it later and sort of?
We take orders.
Okay.
I've actually got orders from people right now with a deposit,
Mm-hmm.
and they, I try to keep at least 2 or 3 in stock
Mm-hmm.
all the time. We don't, it's not that big of a demand for them.
Mm-hmm.
So we keep 2 or 3 in stock, and if somebody calls, just recently, I got a call one night. Oh, it was late, probably about 11:30 at night, and a woman called and said, "Do you make coffins?"
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Yes, I do." And she says, "I need one.
Mm-hmm.
Our daughter died." And a 24-year-old daughter, which was, you hear some really sad, shocking
Mm-hmm.
stories. And, but they were a family that were of moderate means, and didn't have a lot of extra money to spend.
Mm-hmm.
And in the state of Missouri, learning some of the things that you learn,
Mm-hmm.
for an example, in the state of Missouri, you don't have to be embalmed. Okay, you don't have to be put in. Some cemeteries require a concrete vault to
Mhm.
set the coffin into,
Mhm.
but some don't.
Mhm.
And if you want to handle it yourself, you can put your family
Mhm.
body yourself into the wooden box,
Mhm.
and you can take it. Now, within 24 hours, is my understanding
Mhm.
that you have to have the body buried
Mhm.
after death
Mhm.
if it's not embalmed.
Mhm.
And that's what this family was intending to do, was to bury it in a
Mhm.
family cemetery and take it there and take it out and do it themselves.
Mhm.
Which is, in the Ozarks, it's a lot of traditions
Mhm.
still are in place
Mhm.
that people don't talk too much about.
Mhm.
And a lot of it is family burial
Mhm.
and family wakes.
Mhm.
So if someone passes away, they immediately maybe dress the body or
Mhm.
whatever they want to do and put it into the coffin
Mhm.
and then invite the family over
Mhm.
for their final viewing and farewell. They put the lid on,
Mhm.
put it in the back of a pickup truck
Mhm.
because they don't have a hearse,
Mhm.
which is fine,
Mhm.
and take them to the family cemetery,
Mhm.
take them out, get 2 ropes,
Mhm.
4 men,
Mhm.
and lower it down into the grave. After the grave is dug, backfill it, set their own headstone, whatever they
Mhm.
do. And so that still happens,
Mhm.
probably in many places across the United States,
Mhm.
if the truth be known.
Mhm.
But especially here in the rural Ozarks, that still happens.
Mhm. And that's, part of the reason I got interested in learning more about
Mhm.
burial traditions in the Ozarks, because it seemed like there's a lot of that remains, but there's a lot of it that's kind of changing in some ways, and other parts that are going back to those things. And so, that was a question I had too with regards to what you're doing is, have you seen kind of growing interest as people talk about, quote, green burials and things like that might not be from a legacy, but people trying to get back more to the land and things like that?
Seriously, that's a good question, and it is happening. I'm
Mm-hmm.
seeing that now.
Mm-hmm.
Once people found out that I was doing this,
Mm-hmm.
I just got this morning a text for a man wanting two,
Wow.
and people are seeing, they recognize uh, the lavishness of a funeral
Mm-hmm.
is not necessarily something that most people want.
Mm-hmm.
They really, probably, for the most part, would prefer to have it private.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't want to leave friends out. They don't want to leave
Mm-hmm.
families out. So they kind of set up a viewing thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, they're sold on, oh, this is a beautiful
Yeah.
casket here. And the next thing you know, emotions take over
Mm-hmm.
rather than common sense. And they spend a lot more money
Mm-hmm.
on something that maybe wouldn't necessarily be made. So people are now reverting back to, you know what? Those are beautiful, those
Mm-hmm.
old wooden boxes. I can put my own blanket in there. I
Mm-hmm.
can put my own pillow in there,
Mm-hmm.
even though I won't know it.
Mm-hmm.
But I at least would have that, and my family would know that my body is wrapped in one of our family blankets,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm at peace with what was done.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's more important to the family members today. I think they're starting to come back to the old idealisms that, you know what, that's okay. Even cremation. Now, I'm not against cremation at all. I think
Mm-hmm.
that there's a lot of people that do it. And I'm, of course, being a person that reverts back to the good book,
Mm-hmm.
I notice there's scripture in there that says ashes to ashes and dust to dust,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And that's fine. That
Mm-hmm.
means, whatever, a cremation or whatever. But a lot of people say, well, I want to follow the teachings of Jesus, who
Mm-hmm.
was buried
Mm-hmm.
whole bodily.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm going to follow him, I want to follow him all the way. So they
Mm-hmm.
want to be buried full. So that's where the coffin
Mm-hmm.
comes back into play at a minimal cost
Mm-hmm.
and in a grave. Now, my wife and I and my children, we have a private graveyard just down the road here, about 2 miles down the
Mm-hmm.
road, and we have 10 plots in there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where she and I will be buried, laid to rest.
Mm-hmm.
And we will have the wooden boxes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure about my sons or daughters,
Mm-hmm.
whatever they want to do, they can do.
Mm-hmm.
And they're both, my one son, Ryan, who is a general contractor and a
Mm-hmm.
builder, carpenter, excellent carpenter, he could build his own in a New York second.
Mm-hmm.
And he may at some point decide to do that. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know, you know.
You talked about the experience of that family, with the family cemetery, and even your experience. Do you think a lot of people in those situations use vaults, or is it just they just use the coffin?
Well, vaults, like I said, a lot of cemeteries, especially in the cities,
Mm-hmm.
require a vault.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of the, they don't,
Mm-hmm.
what it does is it stops the sinking of the dirt on top of the cemetery for the most part. It doesn't stop it totally, but it supports the weight of the backfill,
Mm-hmm.
and they backfill around it, and that concrete vault doesn't collapse after so many years.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas uh, wooden boxes, dust to dust,
Mm-hmm.
back to dust to dust.
Mm-hmm.
And so then at the top, many old, if you go to the old cemeteries, and I know you do that at times, you'll see sunken spots. And that's because there was no concrete vault.
Yeah.
There was an old casket. More than likely, if it's in this area, it could have been a wooden box.
Probably.
The wooden coffin.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned being from West Plains and being from the Ozarks.
Uh-huh.
I don't trying to ask how old you are, but when you were growing up, did you see people who still used wooden boxes, or they moved away from that at that point?
Very early in my life, I remember one in particular was the wake of a baby that had died, not at birth, but maybe like was 6 months old or 8 months old. I don't remember exactly how old the baby was, but the baby was laid out in a wooden box, a coffin, and he was laid out at home. You see, back in those days, they didn't have funeral homes around like we have nowadays. And so the wake would be held in the home. And the wake at that time lasted from the moment that the baby died. Somebody set up in the house awake all night long while the coffin was there and the baby or the body was there. And that tradition of overnight 24-hour wakes, because then the next day after the family they would bury. They wouldn't leave it for great lengths of time. And the need for embalming, especially in today's world where families are so disintegrated, where you have some on the East Coast, West Coast, they got to catch an airplane to get back. And so they got to preserve the body until, if they want to view, for longer lengths of time. Whereas the old traditions, 24 hours the next day after the person passed, family was there, let's take them to the graveyard, let's do it. And so I did see some of that. I'll be 77 years old this next month.
Okay.
And so in those years from say my earliest recollection of that was probably when I was about 5 years old, maybe. And so that would have been like 1952, 51, 52, and going to a home to that wake to witness that.
Well, and just to clarify, you said you were born in West Plains, but you grew up in Ozark County, correct?
Well, what happened was this. My father was a pastor, and we moved around a lot. I was born at West Plains, and then my grandfather lived there in Ozark County, over near Gainesville, Udall area, Bakersfield, and he fished the North Fork Lake there, and he had 2 log cabins that he built, and people would come there, men would come there and spend the night in the log cabins, and he would take them out and take them guided fishing. And my grandmother would fix a meal, and he made some extra money doing that as later on in his life. And so growing up though, with my dad moving, I moved to Gainesville in the late 50s, early 60s. And it was like living in Mayberry. Sheriff George Rose never wore a gun.
Wow.
I remember him walking, you'd see him, and his son and I, Randy, played basketball together as young boys growing up. And then later on my dad moved us on up then to the St. Louis area in a little town right across the Mississippi River called Columbia, Illinois. And that's where I met my wife, Judy. And I finished out my high school there and graduated there. And then I went into the Navy because at that time, Vietnam was going strong, 1965, 66. And so I went into the Navy. When I got out of the Navy, then, because we were married before I went in, just short time. We were actually married 2 weeks. I was supposed to be home for a year before I got shipped out, and we got married. And about 2 weeks later, I get an activation notice
Wow.
report for duty. So with that said, after then I got out of the Navy, we lived there for a while. And but I always wanted to raise my two sons down here on the lakes and the streams of the Ozarks, where I grew up as a young boy, getting to experience the Bull Shoals, North Fork. I actually got to float the James River here before Table Rock Lake came in
Wow.
1956. Got to float it one time with my grandfather.
Wow.
And we floated it, and he was an excellent fisherman as well. So I got to experience and see some things. 1956, I got on a bus in Gainesville, and with my sixth grade class, and came to Shepherd of the Hills on a field trip.
Wow.
And we had read the Shepherd of the Hills book. And so our teacher said, for a field trip this year, after you read this book, I'm going to take you and show you the old home where they live. And so it was quite a, oh my gosh, you know, in 1956 to get to come and see it was like, oh my gosh, like New York City does, you know. But it was a wonderful life growing up here in these Ozarks, and we got to see a lot of things, and my grandfather's boat building and other things that I saw growing up has kind of cultivated these interest in me and made me want to kind of return back to the ways that things were in the past so that people could still see them and understand them, you know.
That's amazing. It's an amazing story, all of that. I just so appreciate you sharing it. And, you know, I think those are all the questions I had. Is there anything else you'd like to mention?
You know, I just encourage people today to slow down a little bit, especially if you live here in this part of the country, and get off of the road and explore, as you do, a lot of the most beautiful areas that we have. The old mills that ground flour and grain for the people who lived off the land back here. The organization that I belong to, the Hillcrofters, the Society of the Ozarkian Hillcrofters, we have just created a historic route tour through Stone County, Missouri. And we're putting kiosks up at these certain locations where these historic things took place. And people can get on and GPS that route online and on their GPS system. And you can follow that route all around Stone County from over to Hurley Crane, back over to Blue Eye, back in around the whole area. I think there's like 12 different stops. And that's such an interesting route. And for a day trip, and lots of little restaurants along the way that you can stop and enjoy some good food. I know you do that quite often. And you got a blessed, you're very fortunate to have the position and the opportunity to do what you do. It's a wonderful life.
I don't take it for granted.
That's that would be the only thing I'll leave the people with is this. Get out and enjoy these beautiful Ozark Mountains. And there's lots of neat people out here to meet. And there's lots of neat stories to be heard.
Very well said. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I enjoy being with you.